How's it going, everybody? I hope you're all doing well. Okay, so one of Samuel Beckett's best known expressions of his philosophical outlook, such as it is, comes from his 1953 novel, The Unnameable. There, the very last words of the narrator are, "You must go on, I can't go on, I'll go on." Now, this phrase, at the very least, seems to embody a paradoxical vision of human existence. In other words, life is both fundamentally impossible and yet at the same time unavoidably persistent. So let's try to unpack this a little bit. Let's start with the middle part of the phrase, "I can't go on." So I think we could say that this reflects something like Beckett's deep sense of exhaustion and futility in the face of human existence. I mean, exhaustion and a sense of futility clearly seem to mark so many of his characters, right? I don't know how many times in Beckett's stories we're confronted by characters where life is viewed as repetitive and meaningless and deprived of any resolution. Now, the examples here seem endless, but two come immediately to mind. First of all, I think of the character Ham in the play Endgame, who cries out, "Finished! It's finished! Nearly finished! It must nearly be finished!" Where, of course, the play itself rejects any closure. Second, I think of Vladimir Estragon in what is certainly his most famous play, Waiting for Godot. There, of course, the two tramps perpetually wait for a mysterious figure who never ever comes, embodying the pointlessness of expectation. So in such works, Beckett seems to be insisting that to live is to confront a world stripped of any larger purpose or consolation or transcendent order, whether it's religious or moral or metaphysical. Now you might think, well, in this way, he's really no different from the existentialists of his own time. After all, many of them too argue that life is without any ultimate justification or meaning. For instance, the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, in his major work, Being and Nothingness, also presents life as a project without any ultimate foundation, as a nothingness into which consciousness throws itself. Yet, here's the difference though. Where Sartre insists on radical freedom and makes that the very condition of meaning, Beckett rejects even this kind of faint consolation. For Beckett, the ugly truth seems to be that consciousness is something that's trapped in a body that decays and in a language that fails to deliver and in cycles that just can't be surmounted. So in a way, the middle part of the phrase, "I can't go on," is pretty bad. And that's because it seems to not just be an expression of despair, but also the recognition that nothing, neither freedom nor meaning, can atone for the absurdity of existence. Yet for all of this, the paradox that I talked about earlier emerges in the final part of the phrase, where the last words are, "I'll go on." So despite the futility, the narrator, he continues. Okay, but here's the thing. This continuation, I think it's pretty clear that it's not fueled by passion or heroicism or anything like that. In this way, Beckett's view isn't quite like that of his contemporary of the same time, namely Albert Camus. You see, what Camus argues, and he does this in his work, The Myth of Sisyphus, what he basically argues is that the absurd man can rebel against meaninglessness by making it his own and by embracing it. So the point is that there's a heroic gesture in Camus' approach to life. Like the mythical Sisyphus, Camus tells us that we should spite the gods and we should revolt against the futility by living passionately. Actually, we find something similar or of a similar spirit in Nietzsche, an idol of Camus, actually. What Nietzsche does and he too believes that there's no ultimate justification to existence. What he does is he calls for a love of our fate, to affirm life's eternal recurrence with joy. So again, there is a kind of heroic affirmation here too, right? Well, okay, so I think it's safe to say that Beckett strips away this sort of heroicism in the face of despair. I mean, his characters, they don't rebel, they don't affirm with joy. Heck, they hardly move at all. They sort of shuffle along, or sometimes just crawl, dimly aware of things and pretty much defeated. So the point is that progress for them is slow and painful, but they do keep on going anyway. But again, it's not due to any kind of heroicism. No, what it seems to be is a kind of sheer persistence, a blind compulsion to move one foot forward, a survival without justification. Actually, you know what? Now that I think about it, maybe the closest Beckett gets to another philosopher is the famous pessimist, Arthur Schopenhauer. So to state it very generally, according to Schopenhauer, the world is driven by what he calls the will to life. And what this is an irrational force that compels all beings, including us humans, to be continuously striving and desiring and suffering, all without the possibility of any sustained satisfaction, though. Now that seems pretty bleak, of course, but here's the thing. Schopenhauer does argue that it is possible for us to get some consolation and release, at least temporarily. And he believes we can do this through the contemplation of art and through ascetic renunciation. Okay, well, now I think we could say that on the one hand, and in his own way, Beckett echoes Schopenhauer's metaphysical insight, namely that life is nothing but a continual cycle of desire and striving and suffering. But on the other hand, he also empties it not only of any larger system, but more importantly, of the possibility of any kind of consolation or reprieve. In other words, Beckett's characters are never liberated. They never find consolation. No, they seem to be infinitely entangled in the machinery of the will without any way to get free. But here's the thing, they keep on going anyway. So maybe we could say that if Beckett offers any philosophy of life at all, if he does, it's something like a credo of endurance stripped of heroicism or glory and ultimately of any meaning or consolation. His characters persist, but they persist without affirmation and without hope and without justification. Now you might think that this sort of view is completely empty and desolate. And you know what? Maybe it is. Yet I also think it's possible to see a kind of integrity in this endurance. Unlike some other worldviews which adopt a kind of blind positivity, let's say, we might see Beckett's view as an absolute refusal to lie or to conceal anything. It doesn't reject despair, nor does it mask it, though, with consolation. And to continue to acknowledge life in its most bleakest form, stripped of all and any kind of transcendence or hope, and still to keep moving one foot in front of the other, that surely amounts to something. And I think it also has some purchase at a more general level, in the sense that everybody, all of us, face moments of, I can't go on. Yet the fact that humanity continues, that so many of us endure, points to an undeniable strength at the heart of our spirit. In this sense, you could argue that Beckett's outlook is a profoundly heartening articulation of what it means to be human. So, I can't go on, I'll go on is not only a closing line to a novel, but I'd say that more broadly, it's a stance towards existence. It's a declaration of the exhaustion of life in the face of meaninglessness, and yet at the same time, ultimately, an insistence on its continuation anyway. Beckett's vision is shockingly bleak. There's no doubt about that. Yet, it's also strangely powerful. A recognition that human beings, for all of their despair, continue, like Vladimir and Estragon, to speak and to wait and to suffer and to live. In Beckett's world, life is stripped to its barest form. Not salvation, not rebellion, not heroicism, but the sheer, inexplicable, and irreducible fact of going on. Bye for now.